Let's talk about the most dangerous phrase in politics, but they get things done. Because we've all pretty much watched and read Project Hail Mary by now, right? I think it's illegal not to, and we'll get to who made that a law in a minute. Yes, we had a blast watching Rocky and Ryland Grace save the universe together, but while that was going on, did you notice something weird going on in the background? Like everything to do with this woman?
The consensus here is that it would be preferable if you did not die.
Yes, that's Eva Stratt, and spoilers for the book and the film ahead, but who gave this woman unlimited power over the entire planet? And was that a good idea? Well, I can at least answer the first question for you. We did, of course. And I think we have some extra footage from the special features here of the UN voting to give her that power.
For a safe and secure society.
Nope, sorry, that's something else, but you know, close enough. But to answer the second question, whether this was a good idea or the only way, well, that's much harder. So today, let's talk about Eva Stratt, who, by the end of the book and implicitly in the film, personally ordered the nuclear bombing of Antarctica, covered most of Africa in an astrophage breeding panels, copied every piece of intellectual property ever made, invaded a US courtroom flanked by armed soldiers, and again, spoilers, drugged the protagonist into a one-way trip to another star system. But she got the job done, right? And the Earth was saved, right? And that's cool, right? Right? Yeah. So let's dive in and ruin Project Hail Mary for everybody by talking about annoying little quibbles like political philosophy, morality, and ethics, and why annoying philosophers like me are the reason we just can't have nice things anymore. Now look, I want to be upfront. This is not a video about how Project Hail Mary is secretly evil and you're a bad person for liking it. Because I liked it, you liked it. Andy Weir wrote a fun book and a lot of very smart people had a great time reading it. I enjoyed the movie too. Weir said that his narrative doesn't do politics and, well, we'll get into that claim in a minute. But doesn't what Stratt did to Ryland Grace bother you a little, at least on some level? And doesn't it seem like the exact opposite of how Rocky and Grace, the heroes of the film, actually treat each other? And for me, it kind of sucks when, in the book at least, Grace thinks, after remembering all of the horrible things that have been done in the name of saving the universe, that, yeah, she was probably right. I bet many of us thought that too, because it resulted in a story about friendship and a fun adventure. Plus a cool new apartment and teaching gig for Grace. What's not to love? Well, in political philosophy terms, a lot. Because my theory is that Stratt represents a certain way of doing politics, and it's our fault. And I mean our fault as in philosophers' fault, because we invented it. So in 5 parts, I want to get to this. First, how claiming not to be doing politics is itself doing politics. Second, to talk about states of exception, things like emergency powers and their habit of not ending. Third, the end, justifying the means and the reasoning behind that. Fourth, something I'm going to call scientism, which is absolutely not science, and we'll get to the big difference. And fifth, philosophers' biggest contributions to human misery, a thing called the Philosopher King. Where we end up is, I think, a really interesting place, and I'm going to try and convince you that the book actually contains its own counter-argument, and it doesn't even notice. And by the end of the video, that's the part that I think is worth taking home. But first, what happens when you try not to do politics? So Andy Weir says that he doesn't do politics, and Project Hail Mary is famously not a political book. It's definitely not a political movie either. There are no parties, there's no elections, no ideologies, no tedious arguments about planning permission, interrupting the astrophage. It's just smart people solving a very large problem. And that might be very appealing to us, who are frankly frustrated by the inability of our political systems to solve obvious problems. Except that there is no such thing as not doing politics. I hate to say it, but where human beings are, it's always there, running in the background, even if you don't notice it. And the minute we put someone in charge and others have to obey them, we are doing politics. We're just doing it without admitting it in some cases, which itself is a political move, and it's a pretty old one to boot. And Eva Stratt walks into the story and takes over Grace's life almost like an act of God. When he asks her, hey, where do you get this authority to do this? She just says, secret vote at the UN. Oh, and I think we actually finally have the clip of that. Let's roll it.
So this is how liberty dies. With thunderous applause.
Sorry, I keep getting those two mixed up for some reason. Anyway, Grace does try to ask a follow-up question, but he is told, almost by the voice of the author himself, hey, let it go. Just don't worry about it. Which is what Stratt and Weir, through her, is telling us to do too. Just have fun. Just trust the process. To quote Alan Partridge, it just works. And that's the move I really want us to pay attention to, because it keeps happening, both in the story and frankly often in real life. You know, when a political figure takes an extreme action that you might think violates some sort of important principle, and the supporters say, hey, shut up, it just gets stuff done, just go with it. And we go along with it in Project Hail Mary because the science problem is interesting and the politics problems, well, they're complicated. Now imagine if an actual government tried to do this. Imagine if they interrupted that episode of Grand Designs that I was almost certainly watching and said, hi everyone, we had a secret unanimous vote of every nation on Earth at the UN the other day, and we've decided to give Diane from procurement the absolute authority over the planet. I would have questions, like an astronomical amount of questions. And sorry, did you say secret vote at the UN? But Project Hail Mary does not have time for these questions. Project Hail Mary has a sun to fix. And it's a big thing to skip over. And there's danger, I think, in accepting, even in a fictional setting, that an enlightened dictator is something that we can just, yada, yada, yada past. But then Weir writes a courtroom scene with Stratt on trial, representing herself, which, seriously, you have hundreds of scientists, thousands of troops, and not one lawyer? I mean, I understand the impulse, it just seems implausible. Anyway, Stratt has copied every intellectual piece of property ever digitized onto the ship's computer, and the entire IP industry is suing her. She walks into the courtroom, she listens to about 10 seconds of an opening statement, and then she interrupts, she moves to dismiss the case. Asked why, she says, because I don't have time for this bullshit. She produces a treaty granting her personal immunity for any crime anywhere on Earth, which I don't think that's a thing. And then she produces a presidential pardon, and the bailiff moves to restrain her, and then armed soldiers walk into the courtroom, and she says, I have the US Army, and that's a damn fine army. I suppose I'd find it charming if it was Dale Cooper saying it. And then she leaves. And Andy Weir certainly loved writing the scene. I mean, finally, revenge on those high-played, useless lawyers that he went to school with. The IP lawyers are bad guys. They're petty, they're small-minded, they're worried about their stuff while the world is ending. Stratt is saving us all in the narrative. It's played for laughs. But, sorry, I can't help but be an annoying philosopher here, because that scene is bananas. It's a civil suit, so a presidential pardon just doesn't really apply, and they'd be suing the organisation, not Stratt personally, and sending soldiers into a courtroom would cause an immediate constitutional crisis and possibly collapse the US government. And there's a bunch of other mistakes too, don't get me started on it, but it's the quote that I really have difficulty with. I have the US Army, and that's a damn fine army. It really kills me because it's a mashup kind of two separate quotes that might be lurking around in the back of your mind. The first one is Andrew Jackson defying the Supreme Court back ages ago when white settlers were stealing Native American land. And the second one is probably like Stalin dismissing the Pope because the Pope didn't have an army after World War II. But Andy Weir doesn't do politics, I guess? Anyway, it's not the plot holes that matter. I'm not bringing them up to be comic book guy in the comments. I'm bringing them up because it's the sloppiness that is the tell. Weir didn't really bother researching American civil courts because in this book, the law isn't a real thing. It's a narrative friction. It's the thing standing between Stratt and the science. So, of course, she walks out of it. But here's a question I want to put to you. What if Stratt were doing this in 2026? What if there was a super advanced AI solving the astrophage problem? And to make it work, Stratt needed to feed every piece of human creativity, every book, every film, every YouTube video like this one, like and subscribe, every line of code, every painting, every song, everything, every part of human endeavor into that AI without paying anyone or asking permission, and the entire creative industry banded together to sue her. And if she walked in and said, well, I don't have time for this bullshit, would we still be cheering when the soldiers walked in? Because basically, this is what the AI industry is telling us now, that they're working on fundamental existential problems and we're all just friction in the way. So yeah, the argument's less fun when it's our stuff being absorbed into the machine, when we're the petty IP lawyer worried about our work while the smart people save the world. This is what people online have started calling the face-eating leopards problem, because we vote for the face-eating leopards party because they're going to eat all of the other faces, and then one day the leopards are eating our faces and we're shocked. Project Hail Mary is a face-eating leopard story, and we don't really notice it until it's too late. The book is teaching us to enjoy Stratt cutting through institutional friction. We cheer her in the courtroom. We cheer her conscripting the Norwegian scientists. We cheer her at the prison wanting to take in her gun, which is weird, and we cheer her bullying foreign ministers. And then she drugs Ryland Grace and puts him on a one-way trip to another star system. And we're supposed to be cool with that too, because, you know, she got things done. The leopards eat protagonists too, even the ones we like. Now, fairness break here. There's a real argument on Stratt's side. Sometimes, in genuine emergencies, normal process really is too slow. Churchill in 1940 made decisions without full cabinet approval at the height of World War II that most historians now think were correct. Those weren't necessarily democratic decisions, but they do seem to be the right ones. So when Stratt says there's no time for any of that stuff, she isn't making an argument without precedent. She is making one that has, in specific historical moments, been retrospectively vindicated. That's true. But Churchill's decisions could be contested, debated, prosecuted, apologised for. That record survived. The people that were affected knew what had happened. And we'll come back to this, because Stratt's version of emergency authority does something that Churchill's didn't. So we've established that Andy Weir is in fact doing politics. He's just doing the kind that pretends to not be politics at all, where the right person is in charge and the rest of us just get out of their way. But there's a name for what Stratt is operating inside, and it's worth thinking about. It's called a state of exception. It's otherwise known as being a dictator, basically, but we'll get to that too. Now, a state of exception is what happens when normal law gets suspended to deal with a crisis. The usual processes are too slow, so someone has to be able to act and act fast without waiting for the committee to convene or the court to rule. The classic move is, we'll restore normal order once the emergency passes. Trust us, we've got this. And sometimes that works. But a lot of the time, states of exception have a nasty habit of not ending. They start as an emergency measure, as a war on terror or drugs or something else, and then they become the operating system. By the time anyone notices, the people who were exceptions to the rule have become the rule itself. Now, Project Hail Mary stages a state of exception as the natural and obvious response to the astrophage crisis, and the book often plays to Stratt's no-nonsense, get-things-done approach for laughs. But there's a scene late in the novel that I want to walk through carefully, because it's a moment where the state of exception lands on a single person and we get to watch what it actually does. It happens in a flashback. Grace recovers his memory in fragments. He's been working on the project for months. He knows the science. He knows the stakes. He knows the mission is one way. And he has decided that he is not going.
I'm not an astronaut. I put the not in astronaut. I've never done anything. I've never done a space. I can't even moonwalk. I'm not heroic in any way. I get sick on the elevator.
Perfect. There's no elevator on the ship.
I cannot do this.
So he sits down with Stratt at 5 o'clock in her trailer on the launch site. A Russian soldier stands in the corner. Grace explains himself. He should stay on Earth, he says, for the children. He's a teacher. The next generation will need, and Stratt cuts him off. She's not entirely wrong about him. But what happens next isn't an argument, because he says no. And Stratt drugs him and forces him to do it anyway. Now, I want to be really clear about what just happened here, because it's easy to file this under dark but necessary and move on, which is exactly what the book and the film kind of invite you to do. But 4 things have happened simultaneously. One is Grace has been physically coerced. A soldier prevented him from leaving a room, and that alone is a serious violation, but that's the smallest part. The second one is his crewmates are about to be deceived. they're going to be recruited into a lie about why their colleague is unconscious. They never agreed to any of that. And 3, Grace's memory of the coercion will be chemically erased, or at least that's the theory. Not suppressed, but erased. He won't wake up knowing immediately that he was wronged and carry on regardless. I think what Stratt's plan here is that he'll wake up not knowing that he was wronged at all. 4th, and I think this is the one that matters the most, Grace's own values, the children, the teaching, the kids he keeps saying he wants to stay for, have been turned into an instrument of his violation. Just think of the kids, Stratt says. She isn't appealing to his conscience, she's colonising it. And that's the move that I think we really should remember from this, which is not conscription. Conscription, whatever its problems, is at least visible. You know you were drafted, you can resent it, you can refuse it, you can build a legal case against it. What Stratt does to Grace is something very different. She removes his standing to know and act on the fact that he was wronged. The violation is designed to be invisible to the person it was committed against. There is a sentence in the history of post-war ethics that addresses this directly. It's the Nuremberg Code. It was drafted in 1947 in response to the medical experiments conducted in Nazi concentration camps. These are experiments that were justified at the time, by the way, by the argument that the knowledge gained would benefit humanity. And it begins with this, quote, "The voluntary consent of the human subject is absolutely essential. Not important, not required where possible, not strongly preferred, absolutely essential." The word absolutely was chosen deliberately, and it was debated at length because the people who drafted it wanted to foreclose exactly the kind of reasoning that Stratt deploys. Absolutely. Project Hail Mary stages this whole machinery and asks you to find it charming. Just think of the kids. And we did. Which raises the next question that we have to deal with, because the book doesn't just stage the state of exception, it makes us agree with it in a way. And the way it makes us agree with it is the oldest moral argument that we have, that the ends justify the means. So we have Stratt. We have a state of exception. We have a man who said no and was then drugged and then woke up halfway across the galaxy. And the question is, was she right to do it? Because the book, and to a certain extent the film, thinks that she was. Andy Weir thinks that she was too. He said in an interview very plainly that, quote, "The ends justify the means in this case because the species is at stake." And that is the whole moral framework in one sentence. Now, I want to be fair because this is not a stupid argument. If the alternative really is the extinction of humanity, not just suffering, not just hardship, but the very end of life that has ever been or ever will be, then ordinary moral rules start to look small. Derek Parfit spent much of his philosophical career arguing that extinction is incomparably worse than any other catastrophe that merely kills most of us because extinction forecloses every possible future. Place Grace's autonomy on that scale against that, and yeah, it does look a bit small. So the argument has weight. It has about the most weight that an argument can really have. But the ends justify the means is also the oldest atrocity justification we have. It's the sentence underneath every gulag, every famine engineered for the greater good, every show trial. We had to do it. The cause demanded it. History will vindicate us. The species being at stake is the highest form of this argument, but it is the same argument. And what makes it dangerous is exactly what makes it compelling. It is always available. There is always a sufficiently large emergency. There's always a future generation whose interests outweigh your own. Just ask the effective altruists. Once you accept that logic, it doesn't have an off switch. Now, Stratt herself sees this coming. She has an answer. It's a very old one. She tells Grace, quote, "Once the Hail Mary launches, my authority ends. I'll probably be put on trial by a bunch of pissed off governments for abuse of power. Might spend the rest of my life in jail." And she shrugs. She's prepared to pay the price. To me, this read as the Cincinnatus move. Cincinnatus was the Roman dictator who took absolute authority in an emergency, defeated the enemy in 15 days, and then resigned and went back to his farm. It's the gold standard. It's designed to look like accountability. But here's the problem. Accepting your own punishment is, in the end, a transaction you make with yourself. It leaves everyone else outside of it. Stratt agrees to be tried by the governments almost. Fine. But the populations who lived under the Antarctic strikes or the impaneling of the Sahara or a dozen other huge sacrifices, they didn't vote on them. The scientists conscripted didn't consent. Grace didn't choose. They aren't parties to the trial Stratt is so nobly willing to face. Their grievance has no plaintiff. And I think this is the core of the whole problem here, because we already conceded that emergency authority sometimes works. Churchill was right to act without his cabinet. There are real cases where leaders made unilateral calls under impossible pressure, and history said, yeah, fair enough. So the question isn't really, was Stratt right to override Grace? That argument is winnable. The species was at stake. Of course she was right on some accounts. The question is, what's the difference between Stratt and Churchill? Churchill's accusers could hold him to account. The record survived. The people affected knew what had happened. But Grace cannot. He's without memory, potentially, in another star system. The story just quietly gives up on justice. It's another casualty of the ends justifying the means. And there's a philosopher called Michael Walzer who wrote about exactly this kind of situation. He called it dirty hands. You do what you have to do and you carry it. The wrong remains wrong. Necessity doesn't cancel the cost. And there is exactly one character in Project Hail Mary who has dirty hands and knows it. It isn't Stratt. It's, in the book, a French climatologist called Leclerc, who finds himself ordering the detonation of 241 nuclear weapons in Antarctica. He says, quote, "I became a climatologist to help save the world, to stop the nightmarish environmental catastrophe we were sinking ourselves into. And now I'm ordering a nuclear strike on Antarctica." That is a man with dirty hands. The cost that doesn't get cancelled by the outcome. Stratt's response is, well, you did what you had to do. Words that close the wound before it can teach us anything. And that's, to me, the move that the book keeps making every single time. And the film sometimes too. Every moral injury gets sutured before the next chapter begins. You did what you had to do. We're saving the world. Let's get back to the science. A book actually wrestling with these questions would let the wound stay open a little. It would not, having shown you a man chemically conscripted against his will, arrange events so that he concludes within a few chapters that the woman who drugged him was right. But that's exactly what the book does, which means that there's something underneath the politics. Not a politics exactly, but a worldview. A worldview that thinks the values question can be answered in the first place by the right person with enough data, the way you'd answer a scientific problem. And there's a name for that worldview, and it isn't science. Yes, there's a very specific name for the worldview underneath Project Hail Mary. It's called Scientism. And before anyone starts furiously typing in the comments, Scientism is not science. Science is great. Science is one of the best things we ever did as a species. 5 stars from me. Scientism is something different. It's the belief that science can answer questions that science actually can't. Specifically, it's the belief that with enough data, enough expertise, and enough computing power, you can settle questions that are actually moral and political, that values can be derived from facts, that if you just measure hard enough, the right answer will fall out. The philosopher David Hume identified this confusion way back in the 1700s, and it still really hasn't been fixed in our discourse. No matter how many true things you know about the world, you cannot derive from them, by logic alone, a single statement about what ought to happen. In other words, facts don't generate values. You have to bring the values with you. You have to have already decided what matters. And Stratt has already decided. Humanity must survive. That's her dictum. Everything else follows. Once you accept that premise, every action that she takes is just engineering. The Antarctic strike is logistics. Conscription is logistics. The amnesia drug is logistics. But humanity must survive isn't a scientific conclusion. It's a value judgment. And it's the kind of value judgment that if you're going to make it on behalf of 8 billion people, the 8 billion people might want to have a say in. But they don't get one. Project Hail Mary doesn't even pretend to ask them. Scientism is everywhere once you look. The cleanest example of this that I can think of, and that you've probably definitely seen, is signs like, "In this house, we believe in science." But here it doesn't just mean the laws of thermodynamics or the Schrödinger wave equation. It means a whole host of other stuff. We can feel it in that moralistic statement. It means political stuff. It came to mean a whole host of ideological positions and public health decisions and governmental choices that involve not just questions of science, but questions of values, of what is most important and which interests matter and the best governmental means to achieve that end. And I'm not trying to say that it's good or bad, I'm just trying to say that it is more than a question of science. And that is exactly the move that Stratt makes. It's exactly the move the whole book makes. The empirical claim that the sun is dying, that we need to act, is true. Science, no argument. But every other claim that gets bundled with it, therefore Stratt should be in charge, therefore consent doesn't matter, therefore the Antarctic strike is fine, therefore drugging Grace is fine, those aren't scientific claims. They're moral and political claims, riding the authority of the science underneath them. And once you spot that move, you start seeing it everywhere. Trust the experts, sure, but on what? Experts at deciding the empirical question, or experts at deciding what we owe each other? Because those are not the same kind of expertise. Now, one more example, because this is a video about a chemistry teacher told that his expertise gives him the authority to remake the world. And we've all seen that story before. We've watched it for quite a few seasons, in fact. I'm talking about Walter White.
No, I am the one who knocks.
Walter White is a chemistry teacher. He is, by any measure, very good at chemistry. Vince Gilligan, the creator of Breaking Bad, said that the entire show was about turning Mr. Chips into Scarface and watching the audience cheer for it. And we did cheer. For many seasons, Walter cooks meth, kills people, builds an empire, and we rooted for him. And a lot of us only realised what we were doing somewhere around maybe season 4. Why did we cheer? Because he was good at it, because he was competent, because the technical mastery on display, the chemistry, the planning, the cleverness, we read as a kind of moral authority, or at least a right to win. The man who knows what he's doing must be the man who deserves to win. That cheer is a kind of scientism in your living room. That assumption that competence at the technical thing translates into authority over the moral thing. Walter is great at chemistry, therefore Walter gets to decide who lives and who dies. The show was, in part, asking the audience to notice that they'd made that translation without realising it. And Stratt is what happens when the show never makes you notice. When the whole structure of the story has decided in advance that being right about the science is the same thing as being right. And it isn't. The decisions that look technical are almost always the moral ones in disguise. Who pays the cost? Whose consent matters? Whose doesn't? These are not engineering questions, and no amount of experience about the astrophage tells you the answer. So for me, the most dangerous thing about Project Hail Mary isn't that it gets the politics wrong, it's that it's teaching us, gently and pleasurably, that politics is a thing you don't have to do at all. That with the right person in charge and enough urgency in the air, values can take care of themselves. Maybe even a super enlightened AI might do it all for us one day. Wouldn't that be great? No, that wouldn't be great, because it's a Cincinnatus, an enlightened dictator who never resigns. That's the state of exception without end. But here's where I want to stop pointing fingers at the scientists, because the truth is, scientism didn't actually start with the scientists. It started somewhere a lot more embarrassing. It started with us. So look, I've spent 4 parts of this video giving scientists a pretty hard time, pointing at chemistry teachers and the engineers and the rationalist fantasy of just letting the smart people fix it, letting the nerds run Springfield. And that's a little unfair, because scientism didn't actually start with scientists. In fact, it started with philosophers. The whole let the cleverest person rule and everyone else stay the hell out of the way idea is, I am afraid, a philosophy original. It's the oldest fantasy in political philosophy, and we've been pushing it for about 2,500 years now. It's called the Philosopher King. All the kids are doing it, and Plato came up with it. In the Republic, he argues that the ideal society would be ruled by philosophers, people whose superior wisdom and grasp of the truth qualified them to make decisions for everyone else. The rest of you would be assigned to your proper roles. Everyone was supposed to be happier this way, because the people in charge would actually know what they were doing. And reading it now, you can almost see Plato writing himself into the role. Yes, I think the philosophers should be in charge. Funny coincidence that I just happen to be one myself. Anyway, here's 2,000 pages of explaining why. The Philosopher King has had an unbelievable run. Every authoritarian intellectual in history has, at some point, dusted off this idea and given it a fresh coat of paint. The enlightened monarch, the vanguard party, the technocrat, the CEO king, the benevolent AI, the competent woman with a presidential pardon and a damn fine army. Same fantasy, different costume. And it has never worked. Not once. Not because we keep failing to find the right philosopher, although we keep doing that, but because the fantasy itself is wrong. Competence at running a project is not the same thing as competence at deciding whose rights are expendable. Competence at solving a scientific problem is not the same thing as competence at deciding what counts as a solution. Knowing how to do something, in other words, is not the same as having the right to decide whether it should be done. Those cannot be converted into technical questions, no matter how big the emergency, especially not when the emergency is big. Stratt is excellent at her job. She may be the best person who has ever existed at her job, but her job, as the book defines it, is to save humanity. And what saving humanity means, what it costs, who it pays, what it survives, what gets sacrificed, what the saved version of humanity is even allowed to look like, that's not Stratt's job to define. It belongs to the people who it's being done to. And they were never asked. The Philosopher King always thinks this is just a little detail. It's an inefficiency, a luxury the situation cannot afford. That belief, though, that one is a fantasy. And unlike the astrophage, it is not fictional. It's on the news every night. And here's the thing. Project Hail Mary itself contains the answer to its own fantasy. It just kind of doesn't notice. Because there is one relationship in the novel that works completely differently from how Stratt's works. One relationship built on a totally different logic of authority. And it is by a wide margin the part of the book that everyone actually loves. And I'm talking, of course, about Grace and Rocky. Look at how they actually function. Neither has authority over the other. When they disagree, they negotiate. When one doesn't understand something, the other teaches, patiently, creatively, with genuine respect for how hard it is to think across the gap. Their breakthroughs come from both of them being willing to be wrong, to rebuild their models of reality together and to listen. It is structurally the exact opposite of how Stratt operates, and it works in the novel and on us, because it doesn't ask you to suppress the question of whether the relationship is legitimate. The legitimacy is visible in every scene because it is continuously being earned. And this is what I meant in the cold open when I said that the book contains its own counter-argument and it doesn't even notice, because the best parts of Project Hail Mary are an implicit critique of its own political logic. The things that readers love most about the book, the friendship that everyone walks away talking about, is structurally everything that Stratt is not. There's no coercion, there's no deception, no drugs, no memory erasure, there's no appeal to the species being at stake. Just two creatures, completely different, working out how to trust each other from scratch. And on that trust and all of the philosophy behind it, I did a whole video on it if you want to go check it out. And the book contains a working demonstration of what genuine cooperation across radical difference looks like, and then fails to notice that it is sitting on the answer to the question it spent 400 pages avoiding. Because here's the question the Philosopher King fantasy can never answer. Who taught you? Stratt didn't teach Grace, she drugged him. Walter White didn't teach Jesse, he used him. The expert at the top of the technocratic pyramid doesn't teach the people below. They instruct, they command, they override. But Rocky teaches Grace, and Grace teaches Rocky. They build between them a shared language out of nothing, with no shared past, no common authority, no overlap in evolutionary history. And they do it the way that it has always actually been done. Slowly, patiently, with humility, by taking one another seriously, even in the face of a time crunch and a crisis. That's the model. It's been right in front of us all along. So where does this leave us? I do want to be honest about it all because I've spent a long time giving this book a hard time and I don't want to dodge the obvious objection. Stratt did save two worlds in the novel. It's true. By the end of Project Hail Mary, Eva Stratt has saved humanity and Rocky's species. The astrophage problem is solved. The mission worked. The kids that she kept telling Grace to think about do get to grow up. That's not nothing. That's the opposite of nothing. Any version of this video that pretends otherwise is being dishonest. But here's the thing. A politics organised around hoping for a Stratt is not politics. That's a wager. It's a bet that when the moment comes, the right person, competent, ruthless, lucky, willing to do the awful thing, will appear, take charge, will do the awful thing successfully, and will hand the power back when it's over. So Stratt won her wager. The book is a story about the version where that wager pays off. But the 20th century is a record of all of the times that it did not. When competent, ruthless people took charge and either failed or succeeded at something other than they promised, or succeeded but never gave the power back when worse stuff happened. There is no shortage of people in the history books who thought that they were Cincinnatus, but most of them weren't. And every time we tell ourselves the version where it works, we do make it slightly easier for the next person to convince us that it'll work with them and that they're the ones, that it is the emergency, that now is the moment when the rules don't apply. So here's what I think Project Hail Mary actually has to teach us in terms of political philosophy. Saving humanity isn't just about humanity surviving. It's about what survives. If the version that makes it through is the one where we drugged each other into compliance and called it engineering, we didn't save humanity. We saved a body and we lost the thing inside it that was worth saving. The book, I think, already knew this on some level. The part of the book that knew it wasn't Stratt. It was Grace and it was Rocky, the thing worth saving. Two creatures with nothing in common, figuring it out anyway by teaching and by being taught. That part's not a fantasy. That's just how it actually works. Every time it has actually worked. Between people, between strangers, between species even. It's how the next crisis will get solved too, if it gets solved. Not by the right person showing up and dictating to the rest, but by the rest of us, taking each other seriously enough to do the work together, to compromise and to get on with it. So Project Hail Mary, a genuinely beautiful book about friendship wrapped around a deeply weird book about politics and authority. You should read it, you should watch it, you should enjoy Rocky. He really does make the jazz hands in the film. It's great. Just don't take home the wrong lesson. So until next time, be wise and be kind and try not to drug your colleagues, even to save the species.